I grew up in the music world in Wales in the late 60s and then through the 70s. And in the early 70s, I found myself in the National Youth Orchestra as a cellist and was quickly exposed to the music of Alun Hoddinott, mainly through his Welsh folk cultural dances. And I remember, this was my first taste of new music, and it seemed to encapsulate so many different moods and spirits of dance and colour and the language and the landscape. And it wasn't until many years later, when I first started conducting his music, that I had the pleasure of meeting the man. And it came as a delight to realise that this was one of the most genial, one of the most affable, generous personalities as well. And having met him, I could then relate to that quality in his music.
Grant Llewellyn, the Associate Guest Conductor of the BBC National Orchestra of Wales. The orchestra is halfway through a year-long celebration of the life and music of Alun Hoddinott, and I'm delighted that we're here in Alun's beautiful home in the heart of the Gower. Alun, after more than 5 prolific decades of composing, your creative powers seem to show no signs of diminishing. Where does all this creative energy come from?
Well, that's something I really don't know, but I simply have to fill in every day, and I've got ideas, and I just sit down and do it. At my age, one doesn't feel like travelling about a great deal, and I simply like sitting in my room and getting on with the work. It's intellectual work, essentially, which I think all creative work is to a certain extent.
Of course, I remember you've always had this energy, because I remember when I was one of your students at Cardiff University, I used to marvel at the fact that you'd be teaching us all day when I knew that you'd been up probably half the night writing. Was that a difficult time, juggling your life as a professor with the demands of your composing?
It wasn't difficult, but it was a very busy time. And one simply had to coordinate everything so that you could use all the time to maximum effect. Mind you, it did get a bit hectic sometimes, and I got nearer to more deadlines than I'd care to admit to now.
So you burnt the midnight oil on many occasions?
Oh, very much so. And morning oil too.
When you are writing, how do you structure your day? Is there a set pattern of starting writing at a particular time and working for a set number of hours? Is there a ritual for you?
Not a ritual, but there is a pattern. I like an early start to the morning. I can't work at all in the afternoon. I dislike afternoon work. And then I can work in the evenings and into the night. And I always have to have complete quiet when I'm working. I'm not one of these people, say like Mio, who could sit at the window of his flat in Paris, looking out at the traffic and writing his music.
And when you're writing, do you envisage the person who'll be listening to it when it's completed? And do you want them to feel something of what first galvanised you into writing the piece?
I don't generally think of an audience. I mean, obviously one has to think of an audience for specific pieces. Say like the Welsh dances. You think of what you want that audience to imagine when they hear that kind of piece.
So the audience reaction, is it important to you how they react?
What is most important to me, especially in the first performance, is the actual quality of the performance. I think that a composer suffers if the quality of that first performance is not very good. But when it's first rate, then you can feel that the audience will react. Some will like the music, some will not. But what I would always prefer is that there's a reaction of some kind, whether it's like or dislike. What I would not like to happen is an attitude of indifference.
What do you feel when you're actually creating?
The emotional start of a work is most important, and one can get this stimulation without even writing any of the music down. I find that I imagine the kind of piece that I want to write and then start finding the notes to fill out that idea.
Do you ever find that you're confronted with a blank sheet of manuscript and you're not in the right frame of mind for composing? Is there any sort of displacement activity for you, or are you very, very disciplined?
Well, I'm disciplined, but there are times when, the notes just don't come. But there's always some drudgery work to fill out the time with, like writing out a score or correcting things and all that. There's always something to do. Writing music is hard work, and there's quite a lot of boring work involved, in the copying. And I don't use computers or any mechanical method of doing things, and everything is pen and ink and paper and done by hand.
It seems to me that is a much more, all right, it may be drudgery, but it's a much more beautiful way of creating music, to actually create that shape on the page.
Yes, I enjoy the physical act of putting the notes on paper, and one of the moments I like least is when I see a piece in print, when it's been transferred from my handwriting to a printed copy. And curiously, I don't have much feeling left for that piece after I see it in print, and I never want to look much at printed scores.
I know you have a passion for the South, for Italy, at least in the past you have, and that many of your major works, if I'm right, have been conceived and planned under those blue Mediterranean skies in the past. Do you think that this passion has affected your style? Has it helped you to approach and see things from different angles?
I don't think it has particularly, but obviously I've absorbed the sounds and everything else. Some things I've taken into the music quite literally. Like the first time I heard the sound of cicadas in Italy, and I've tried to get that sound in one or two specific pieces.
Of course, the BBC Orchestra here in Wales has been very important, I assume, during your career, because they've played many of your works. And I'm wondering whether the players in the orchestra have enabled you to stretch and challenge them as individual players in the works that you've written.
Oh, yes. I was delighted with writing this orchestral piece, Lizard, the last orchestral piece I've written, because I knew I could explore the virtuosity of the players. And the piece is a virtuoso piece in every department of the orchestra. And it was a great pleasure to go to a first rehearsal and see some of their faces. The end result was quite staggering to me. I mean, I couldn't have written that piece in 1950.
I know historically that you enjoy being with the players and talking with them and finding out their reaction. I mean, is that important to you, to actually talk to the players who are going to be playing your work?
Yes, I always enjoy that. And I have to say, I learn a lot from them, because they do teach me things that they can do with their instruments that otherwise I would not know about.
I know that in your early days you used to meet other composers at the Cheltenham Festival, people like Vaughan Williams and Britain, Arthur Benjamin. What sort of an influence did they have on your formative years?
I started going to the Cheltenham Festival in, I think, 1947-48. It really was my first contact with other composers who were major figures. The older composers, of course, one didn't come into much contact with. One met them and one spoke with them. But the younger composers then, I did become very friendly with people like Peter Racine Fricker and Alan Rawsthorne, Australian composer Don Banks, Humphrey Searle, and of course Arthur Benjamin, who looked at my work for quite a number of years. And it was all very, very stimulating to meet and talk with these other people. I think this is a thing that one lacked in Wales, was this meeting, a constant meeting with other composers. I did get to know Daniel Jones and Grace Williams, and I saw quite a lot of them for a long time. It's all very interesting.
I'd love to have been a fly on the wall then to see this group of young composers together. I mean, you talk about your own feelings about composition, about what was happening where.
A little of that, but the more interesting sort of parts of the conversation were concerned with the technicalities. And what I did find is that composers were always ready to talk about the technicalities of how to do things and all the rest of that. As well as being interesting, it is instructive too. I mean, I remember talking with Britain for quite a long time about the technique of harp pedaling. And, you know, one sort of learnt a great deal about things.
I think, well, it seems to me that much of your Celtic temperament in your music is there underneath the drive, sometimes that sort of sombre brooding, fiery outbursts, and that love of language which you have. Would you say that the Welshness is intrinsic rather than external, that it's in the mood and the atmosphere of your music rather than the structure?
Oh yes, certainly. And I think a great deal of it is to do with early life and impressions. If, for example, one were English, one would have gone to church services and been brought up in the English church anthem traditions. And that music is quite different from Welsh chapel music, which is non-existent. And I was lucky with my first violin teacher in that from about the age of 5 onwards, I was brought up on essentially Italian Baroque violin music. So that's always turned my music towards the Baroque traditions in preference to the sonata tradition of the Austrian composers. And I've never written in that sonata tradition. It's always been a Baroque adaptation of things.
If you were to sit down and just to listen to a piece of music for your own pleasure, what would it be?
I enjoy listening to most pieces. I tend to avoid the 19th century, apart from composers like Berlioz, and I listen to some Beethoven. I always get pleasure from, as long as I don't listen too often to Beethoven. And then I think for pleasure I listen to work like Debussy La Mer. I always get pleasure from listening to Debussy.
Are there different challenges today for young composers?
I think the challenges have always been there, but I think that they're on a larger scale these days, because the last 100 years has seen so much expansion in the techniques of writing music that now a young composer is faced with a huge array of technical devices that he can use. And I think that this really takes a lot of getting over. If you were a young composer 100 years ago, there was no question of the kind of music you'd be writing. It would be in the Brahms, Wagner, whatever tradition. But when you think of music from 1900 onwards, the changes have been enormous, and you have so many composers of major stature, all writing in different ways and producing different sounds. And one has to get to know such a great deal more music these days as you are learning, as it were. It's not enough just to find that you've got something to express. You have to find a logical and an interesting way of saying these things. So the choice is immense. Mm-hmm. And I think it takes a young composer a much longer time to achieve a personal voice, which is essential.
Can you teach someone to compose, or does it have to be an innate talent that someone has?
Oh yes, you can teach somebody to compose. I mean, it's a disciplined, regulated manner of putting notes on paper, and you can teach the rules of how to set about it, and you can get somebody to produce a piece that looks okay on paper. But if there's no feeling or imagination behind it, it doesn't work as music.
But it's this moot point of inspiration then, which I would guess is the feeling and the emotion, which is the secret ingredient then.
Yes, I think so. You have to have some spark of something that turns it from exercises into music.
In 100 years' time, when people are still listening to your music, what do you hope that they will glean from it?
I don't know. Perhaps a reflection of what musical thinking was like in this particular period.